Hello and welcome on behalf of the United Nations Association UK. My name is Stuart Wood and I'm the chair of UNA UK. I'm delighted to have you all with us for this wonderful event. UNA UK is a charity devoted to connecting the public in the UK and worldwide to the work of the United Nations. And we provide information and analysis on UN issues and promote ways to make the UN more inclusive, more transparent, accountable and effective. And that includes working with the UK government and with other governments, as well as with civil society across the world. And we are absolutely delighted to host today's event. We had the pleasure of hosting Under Secretary General Hochschild in the autumn of 2019, before the UN 75th anniversary had been launched. And it's really wonderful that we can host him again today to present the final results of the global consultation that was carried out last year. A year that was filled, as we know, with suffering and hardship, when the long-standing challenges and the weaknesses in our various societies and economies were made painfully obvious, but also a year when we saw enormous courage and solidarity among people and across countries, and a resurgence of interest in our work and the work of other groups we work with in stimulating greater global cooperation. And I think we all agree that that cooperation is so clearly needed, not just to tackle COVID-19, but also so many of the other challenges that we all face. And that message emerged clearly from the UN 75 dialogues and activities that UNA UK organised. And I also believe from the global consultation, which we'll hear more about today. And I understand that James Bell from Pew and Penelope Matzaris from Edelman will also be able to comment on some of the UK specific results as well. So with that, thank you again for being in attendance and for watching. And I would like to hand over to Nitya Kemker, who's head of the UK Liaison Office of UNOPS. He's going to say a bit more about the UN entities based in the UK. And although UNA UK is not part of the UN system, we have worked closely and will continue to work closely with the many offices here. And we like to consider ourselves part of the UN family. So thank you, Nitya, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Lord Wood. Good evening, everyone. I'm Nitya Kemker from the United Nations Office for Project Services. On behalf of the UN agencies based in the UK, I thank you for this opportunity to deliver a joint statement at the policy briefing to mark this milestone birthday of the UN. Thank you also to the United Nations Association UK for hosting this meeting this afternoon. As heads of missions and representatives of UN agencies in London, we are a small but active group that works constructively towards deepening the relationship between our organizations and the United Kingdom government and partners across civil society, academia, and the private sector, complementing the work of our respective headquarters and UK missions in Geneva, Rome, Copenhagen, and New York. This is a time for unprecedented change for the United Kingdom as it ushers in a new era post its separation from the EU. The formation of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, changes in the international aid budget, and new strategic development priorities all present renewed opportunities for engagement between the UN and the UK. As we embark upon a decade of action to achieve the SDGs amid a global pandemic, we are committed to working together to deliver on a more inclusive, greener, and equitable world. The UK has historically been one of the strongest advocates of the multilateral system, specifically the United Nations, since its foundation. It leads the way in working across the humanitarian, development, and peace nexus, and has played a critical role by investing in and promoting our joint efforts to tackle the world's most pressing development challenges: multidimensional poverty, widening inequality, and climate change. The UK has also been pivotal in driving a more effective and accountable aid system, including, for example, through its engagement in the Grand Bargain and its leadership on improving safeguarding standards. For example, with UK support, UNICEF and UNFPA are working together to end harmful practices such as child marriage and female genital mutilation. UK support also contributes to providing modern contraceptives, medical supplies, education opportunities, and humanitarian relief. These are critical to achieving gender equality and ensuring rights and choices for all. To advance the 2030 agenda and support the achievement of the SDGs, the United Nations Office for Project Services and the UK are working together in many fragile and conflict-affected regions to deliver on our expertise in infrastructure, procurement, project management, human resources, and financial services. In the UK, UNHCR works closely with the government, providing advice, guidance, and training on refugee and asylum law and policy, and advocating as necessary for improvements to law and practice. UNHCR also partners with the UK government and the IOM in refugee resettlement, for which the UK has the largest program in Europe. Globally, the UK is a major supporter of UNHCR programs in favor of refugees and internally displaced persons. Around the world, the UK is a critical supporter of IOM's efforts to deliver essential humanitarian assistance in complex crises and natural disasters, to protect migrants from violence, exploitation, and abuse, including modern slavery and refugee resettlement. The production and analysis of human mobility data is also a key element of work which helps to equip policymakers, governments, and agencies to make informed and evidence-based decisions. The World Food Programme, in partnership with UNHCR, has introduced an innovative iris scan payment system in Jordan's Zaatari refugee camp, allowing 76,000 Syrian refugees to purchase foods from camp supermarkets using a scan of their eye instead of cash. This makes it easier and more secure for the refugees while also enhancing accountability. Now, these examples illustrate efforts jointly undertaken to tackle today's complex global challenges and promote sustainable development. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has placed enormous stress on governments, health authorities, societies, as well as individuals. The disruption to livelihoods, public services, and the freedom of movement due to the pandemic have only further exacerbated the needs of vulnerable populations, particularly in fragile and crisis-affected contexts. We applaud the significant role the UK has played so far in our joint efforts during this pandemic and its commitment to the benchmarking of standards as we persevere to build forward better. However, the pandemic has also unearthed deep-rooted fragilities in our societies and economies. The assumptions of how development is being delivered are also being reevaluated. It is in this context that the UN Secretary General saw the organization's 75th anniversary as an opportunity to listen to the people it serves and ask them to identify priorities for building a better future for all. Over 1.5 million people took part in this remarkable survey, representing all UN member and observer states. In addition, Edelman Intelligence and the Pew Research Center polled 50,000 people in 50 countries. Collectively, this data represents the UN's most far-reaching effort to understand the priorities, challenges, as well as solutions for the future. For the world to meet the SDGs and leave no one behind, international cooperation and transformative action based on mutual trust and effectiveness is key to making the world a more equitable place for all. It is our collective intention to deepen the strategic alignment and strong partnership between the UN's mandate and operations and the UK's priorities. Additionally, we look forward to our close partnership with the UK in 2021 as it takes on the mantle of the G7 presidency and COP26 to deliver on our joint strategic priorities in the future, as well as an opportunity to put many of the issues identified in the UN75 report at the heart of the international agenda. It is clear that finding solutions to some of the challenges that have been identified in this UN75 global consultation will help countries ramp up human development outcomes and develop a sustainable growth strategy that is pro-poor, pro-women, pro-nature, and pro-jobs. I invite you now to watch a film to show the results of the UN75 global consultation.
2020 was a year that tested us in ways that we've never been tested before. It was also the United Nations 75th anniversary, and to mark the occasion we sent out an invitation to the world. Tell us your hopes and fears, we said, and tell us how we can work better to get towards the world we all want. Over 1.5 million of you replied, from every single country in the world. And regardless of where we live, or the pressures and challenges we face, no matter how rich or poor, woman or man, your messages confirmed what we have long held to be true, that there is much more that unites us than divides us. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need for better access to basic services. 500,000 called for better access to healthcare services, with 300,000 more urging better access to education. Across the world, you spoke of great concerns about levels of poverty, inequality and conflict. Many of you worry about risks arising from new technologies. And you demanded greater respect for human rights and more employment opportunities. Climate change and the destruction of our natural environment was the greatest concern of all. But there is hope, and it lies with youth. More than half of the people who responded were young people. And with more investment in youth and greater opportunities to work together and across boundaries, we can build a more sustainable world for all. 86% of you said that international cooperation is vital in shaping the future we want and need. We gathered your responses and presented them to world leaders at the 75th United Nations General Assembly on September 21st, and they unanimously agreed with you. Now is the time for action. The good news is that we have the tools to achieve the sustainable future we all want and need, and the Sustainable Development Goals are our roadmap to get there. Urgent efforts are required, and that's why, in this, our birthday year, we choose action over celebration.
Thank you. That was very illuminating indeed. I would now like to hand over proceedings to Elizabeth Fowey, Director, World Food Programme UK. But before that, just a quick word on housekeeping. The audience is invited to send questions to the panel using the Zoom function, the chat option on the Zoom function. So please do go ahead and send us your question. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nitya. And good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this event. I'm going to introduce our presenters, our three speakers. First of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Fabrizio Hochschild, who is the UN's Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor on UN75. He will provide remarks on the main findings and conclusions from the consultation from this UN survey and global listening tour. After that, James Bell, Vice President of Global Strategy at the Pew Research Center, will present his work. And the third speaker is Penelope Mansaris, who is the Senior Vice President of Edelman Data and Intelligence, and there they are. So thank you very much, and I will pass over now to Fabrizio.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Nitya, and my warm greetings and admiration to Lord Wood. First, let me say that we know many of you are living in difficult quarantine conditions with the resurgence of the virus in London, and our thoughts and our solidarity is with you all. UNA UK have been a key partner throughout, more than a key partner, a major contributor. I mean, we were deeply grateful that we were able to brainstorm with you, as Lord Wood indicated, on the approach in late 2019. We're even more grateful that you let Natalie help us, and she was a very critical leader in this effort throughout, and we're deeply grateful for all the experience and skill she brought with us to this exercise. As was indicated, this was a unique global reality check, an effort to capture people's hopes and aspirations, but also their fears for their future, and specifically their expectations of international cooperation. We also, for the first time, I think, of anyone, tried to capture people's priorities for post-COVID recovery. The outreach, despite the transition we had to go through due to the pandemic, I think was large enough to be really representative. We got, as was indicated, about 1.5 million responses to primarily to our own direct survey, but then there were spin-offs from the survey. UNICEF did a spin-off that got hundreds of thousands of responses. We also had thousands of so-called UN75 dialogues that went into more detail. I think a total of about 3,500 were registered. We did detailed analysis of the outcome of over 1,000 in 100 countries. And then, of course, we were very lucky to partner with Pew Research Foundation, and you'll hear from Jeb, and with Edelman, who did independent, science-based, solid surveys for us to give us a reality check from the results we did through a more opportunistic, larger scale methodology. Edelman also did a fairly unique sentiment analysis of using AI and other tools of media, social media and traditional media in 70 countries. And finally, we reached out to well over 100 universities and think tanks and got their thinking around the questions. As I'd like to share before Jeb and Penelope go into more detail, I'd like to share some of the findings that struck me, especially from this last report. Again, I was struck by the unity there is. There are, of course, nuances and differences of view between regions, and I'll speak to some of those, but there was a very large degree of unity when it comes to what people see as the biggest threats, what they see as the priorities for international cooperation, and what their expectations are of international cooperation. For those who know the survey, you'll recall that post-COVID, the biggest priority is better access to basic services, in particular health services, not so surprisingly. But the second priority, perhaps more strikingly, is the call for greater solidarity with the hardest hit countries and the hardest hit communities. The longer term priorities are climate change and environmental degradation, where there's a lot of fear, and other priorities are longer term resolving conflict, dealing better with poverty and corruption, and upholding human rights. Throughout, we saw a strong support for international cooperation. A full 97% of all those surveyed see international cooperation at least as somewhat important, and the majority see it as essential. So those, in a nutshell, are the main findings. But I want to talk a bit about the nuances now and how the findings evolved a little as responses came in before and after COVID. First, I think what was striking is that the number of people who ranked international cooperation as essential rose as COVID progressed. So you have this paradox that as COVID induced borders to be more closed than ever before, as COVID stopped us traveling, as COVID kept us more trapped than ever in our homes, more isolated than ever from others, people's awareness of international cooperation, people's awareness of global issues actually grew. And I found that quite a striking finding. it was also interesting to see where the largest support for international cooperation was. And the highest ranking for the importance of international cooperation came, in fact, from the North America region. It was also rated very highly in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in Europe. Another thing that evolved strikingly over time was concern around unemployment. It didn't rank very highly in the early responses at the beginning of the year, but it moved from 10th priority in the first months of 2020 to 6th priority in summer. And that obviously makes sense against the backdrop of growing unemployment globally, induced by the COVID slowdown of our economies. The other thing striking, I mentioned the finding about calls for greater solidarity. That was particularly strong in middle income and developing countries. In high income countries, the call for solidarity was not so strong. However, what was strong as a second post-recovery priority in high-income countries was a demand for a readjustment of our economies to make them more inclusive. So I think what we know, and Edelman also brought this out very strongly in their findings, that inequalities have been laid bare. Nitya also made this point in her remarks. Inequalities, pre-existing inequalities, have been laid bare by COVID and in many cases exacerbated. And that's clearly, addressing that better is clearly a major priority of people post-COVID. In the most developed countries, that's seen more through the angle of making adjustments to our economies to make them more inclusive. In the developing world, it's seen more through a demand for greater solidarity. Another thing striking in terms of regional differences is different levels of optimism, and we can speculate later about why this is the case. We didn't drill down on the regions, but it was very striking that in the least developed countries, as well as in countries that are in conflict, optimism about the future is much higher than in the most developed countries. So paradoxically, the worse people are off in terms of poverty or in terms of conflict, the more hope there is for the future. And where people actually enjoy higher levels of peacefulness and higher levels of income, there's a lot of concern about there's a greater amount of concern about where we will be, where the world will be 25 years from now. In terms of concern for the environment, while it's universal, there are also interesting regional differences. The highest concern for the environmental destruction and climate change is, unsurprisingly, in Latin America and Caribbean, and that would have been exacerbated by record-breaking hurricane season in the Caribbean this year. Oceania, the concern is also very high, as well as in North America, Europe, Eastern and Southeastern Asia. So there are nuances there, but unsurprisingly, it's some of the continents that for the moment are hardest hit, where the concern is most acute. One word about follow-up. I mean, these findings, initial versions of these findings led into the UN75 declaration. The findings will be used now by the Secretary General, basically to put forward to member states proposals, which he'll do in summer this year, of how to reimagine and upgrade international cooperation in light of the concerns expressed and the hopes expressed and the ideas expressed through the data we gathered. And that will be considered in late summer by member states. We will be putting, or have put, all our data on a platform, so it's available for everybody to look at in much more detail. What we've published, the reports we published are syntheses, but all the detailed data is now available on a platform that anybody can consult and use. And we hope very much that the data and the work we've done will contribute to creating a conducive environment for the sort of upgrading and refocus of international cooperation that both the Secretary General and we the people so clearly want. So please do use that platform and make the most of this unique exercise of a sort of global pulse check that we undertook. And thank you again for all being so instrumental in helping us achieve what has been done over the past year.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. That's fascinating. And I'd like to introduce now James, who's from the Pew Research Center. And James will go into a bit more detail on the representative survey that they conducted for the UN in 14 OECD countries, with a special emphasis in terms of the perceptions of the UN, but also the UK's public opinion. So over to you, James.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And thank you, Fabrizio, for that overview, touching on so many important aspects of the work that was done, both research in the vein of what we did at Pew Research Center as part of UN75, but also the broader dialogue, the global dialogue, really an impressive effort. And looking forward, as we have before, Penn and I sharing the stage with Penn and her team at Edelman, because it really is this remarkable partnership at multiple levels, right? And it's been great to be part of it as the Pew Research Center. So let me share my slides. I'll try to be quick, and hopefully there'll be some good question and answer period for everyone to dig in. So here we go. So you can see the title of my presentation today. I will say a little bit more in a second about who we are at the Pew Research Center. But I thought I would highlight 4 key findings that I hope you can hear now. And as we go through, I'll be sharing slides with considerable amount of data on them. And we just don't have time to go through every data point, but happy to return if that's helpful. But there really are 4 key things I would hope you take away as an audience from what I'm sharing today. And it builds on what Fabrizio was talking about in terms of some of the broad global findings. But again, we were focused on 14 of the major UN donor countries. I'll explain why those 14 in just a moment. But looking at those 14 countries, looking at the United Kingdom as part of that set of 14 countries, the 4 things that I would highlight for you is that in the year of COVID-19, much like Fabrizio said overall, we found in our polling that public support for international cooperation did not decline. It remained robust. So that's an important finding. Secondly, the United Nations as an institution is recognized for pursuing its core mission, that core mission being around the idea of promoting human rights, promoting peace and stability, and promoting sustainable development. Publics that we surveyed recognized the UN for pursuing that mission. At the same time, there are fewer people that we surveyed convinced that the United Nations consistently delivers results, which is something worth discussing if the audience would like to. Third point that I'd like to emphasize, and this is truly in line with what Fabrizio was saying, between what we did at Pew Research Center, what Penn and her team did, and what the dialogues highlighted, you have short-term and long-term goals or challenges in front of us as a planet, as an international community. Fabrizio mentioned the difference between the short-term and long-term. For us, we focus on long-term, major global threats. And as Fabrizio mentioned, climate change, remarkably, is just as important in a year of COVID-19 as preventing the spread of infectious disease. And we've seen climate change matter in previous years, especially in these countries we surveyed. And so that importance of climate change was not diminished by the fact of the pandemic. And the final point I will make is that in the United Kingdom, as in some of the other countries that we surveyed as part of the UN75 initiative, while there is this robust support for international cooperation in many cases and an overall tendency to say international cooperation is good, there are competing narratives, and in particular among people who are supportive of right-leaning populist parties, such as what had been the Brexit Party, UK First Party in the United Kingdom. There is a competing narrative about putting one's nation's interests first. And one of the questions that Fabrizio and others have raised in the context of talking about what these findings mean is, will we always find the political will to take action globally? And there is this political challenge that not everyone necessarily shares the same views of the majority, and who these people are and how influential their voices are matters. So there are 4 key takeaways. Now I'll walk through some of the findings, show you some of the data, and then turn it over to Penn after I finish. So just a word about who we are at the Pew Research Center. If you're not familiar with us, and I don't presume you are, we are nonpartisan and most importantly, non-advocacy. We don't take policy positions, purely oriented towards research, informing public dialogue, which is why we were so appreciative of being invited to be part of this UN75 dialogue. We are charitably funded. In fact, we depend really on one primary source, the Pew Charitable Trust, our parent organization, for our funding. What is remarkable is they don't tell us what to do. We really engage with external audiences to figure out what are the most pressing questions that we can try to tackle through our methods. And one of our primary methods is public opinion research. So really this presentation comes out of working closely with Fabrizio and the UN75 team, including Natalie, to figure out what are some of the important questions that we can try to tackle through the lens of public opinion research. And finally, really we are about dialogue, and it's just great to be part of this dialogue as it continues, even with today's event. So again, thank you to everyone for being here. You're not going to see us talking about every country in the world. We partnered with the UN75 team, with Penn and her team, to cover the 50 countries mentioned. Normally, we would be active in many or most of those countries ourselves, but COVID-19 interrupted our normal business model, which relies a lot on face-to-face polls, especially in the global south. So we focused on a meaningful set of countries we thought being major UN donor countries, including the UK. So that's how we landed on 14, because we just couldn't do things the normal way we do them in 50 countries this year. And great to have Edelman stepping in to help us cover those countries. And finally, I don't want to dwell in details here, but I just want the audience to know this kind of information is available. If you have questions about how we did the work, offline, online, you can ask those questions. Always happy to talk about how we do our work. Just know that these are nationally representative surveys we're talking about in the countries that we did poll in. So let me go through some of the data behind those 4 key findings I mentioned at the beginning, and then we'll make time for questions and answers. So support for international cooperation, it did survive of the pandemic, at least when we were doing our polling, which was last summer. So I will admit to you, I am very curious to know where these publics would come down on the question of international cooperation as we move through multiple waves of the pandemic, but also when we move into distribution of the vaccine, both within countries and internationally. But in the summer, after a major wave of infections and major repercussions economically and at a personal level, often, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 virus, we did see continued support for international cooperation. And what this question was asking was, did you, if you think about it, would have greater international cooperation by our country made it possible for our country to have fewer cases of COVID-19? The answer was generally yes. If you look at the bottom of this chart, 6 in 10, a median, the middle score across these countries, said it would have been better for their country to have cooperated more with other countries. Not everyone agreed with that. We can come back to why, and there might be some differences here in countries like Denmark and Germany. Hint is they felt they did pretty well on their own. We asked about that separately, but generally support for international cooperation survived the pandemic as of last summer. What else can we say about support for international cooperation during the year of COVID-19? Well, when we talk about the UN itself as an institution, as an emblem and a real foundation of multilateral cooperation, favorable views prevail in the countries we surveyed. Again, if you look at the bottom, they get the middle score across all 14, the median score. It's roughly 6 in 10 saying they have a favorable opinion of the United Nations. So that's another indicator that you have support for international cooperation, even in the context of COVID-19. Again, a few exceptions. We can come back to those in Q&A if people want to explore those. I'm highlighting here, and I meant to emphasize in the previous one with a little blue shading where the UK fits in, and you can see that it's a little above the median score. 7 and 10 in UK say they are a favorable opinion of the United Nations. So where does this support for the UN come from? Well, one of the things it does seem to reflect is general orientation or worldview. And you can see this slide asking about, well, in general, should our country put its own interests first, even if other countries disagree? Or should we take the interests of other countries into account, even if it means making compromises? And again, go to the bottom, a very consistent pattern across some of these questions. Around 6 and 10 across these countries are saying we should cooperate to the point of compromise. And again, you can see where the UK fits in relative to these other countries we polled, with roughly 7 and 10 in the UK having that opinion. So really, UK comes in at a very consistent level of broad support for international engagement, broad support for cooperating with other countries, and relatively stronger on this score compared to some of the other countries we polled and among the developed advanced economies we surveyed. It's also a bit informed by performance. Now, what we saw across the countries we polled in 2020 is that how the WHO handled the coronavirus outbreak could hurt, drag down favorable opinion of the UN. It didn't seem to really boost it necessarily, but it could hurt it. So it's not necessarily a given that publics, the UK and public included, would think that the WHO handled it well, nor that that reflected well in the UN. It actually worked against favorable opinion of UN in Japan and South Korea at the bottom of the slide. But in the UK and other countries, there's generally a favorable rating of how the WHO handled the pandemic outbreak, at least as of last summer. And that certainly was a factor in continuing favorable opinion of the United Nations and its community of organizations on the world stage. So let's take a closer look at the UN, second part of one I wanted to highlight. These are the things we asked about. Does the UN do these things? Does it promote human rights? Does it promote peace? Does it promote economic development? And you can see the other categories. Some of them are more issue oriented. Let me just focus on the top three. These are, I think, very much the elements of the core UN mission. You can see that the UN is being recognized for doing these things. So this is not just, do you like this about the UN? You're being asked, does it do these things? And the answer is yes. So there's recognition that the UN is pursuing core elements of its mission. Majorities also give it credit for pursuing other important things, such as helping to prevent the spread of infectious disease. 6 and 10 say that. Where you see the most mixed opinion, it's not negative, but it's mixed, it's divided, is whether the UN cares about the needs of ordinary people. Is it attuned to those needs? And does it deal effectively with international problems? The last two categories on this slide. And so the last category is a way of saying, is the UN delivering results? And their opinion is mixed. Let me tell you, let me go back, sorry about that, to then go forward and say that where the UK falls compared to some of the other countries, this is just looking at the European countries in our survey, it's very much in line with this view of the United Nations, promoting human rights, promoting peace. Those are the most common and second most common responses among the UK public. Promoting economic development, nearly 7 in 10 say that's true. And where there is the most mixed opinion of how the UN is performing is whether it's actually effectively solving international problems. The UK kind of fits that overall pattern. Now, Fabrizio talked about global threats. I just want to touch on this. I'm going to confirm what he said. If you think long-term, what comes to the top of mind in terms of major global threats, challenges for the world, it's climate change in our poll, tied essentially with the spread of infectious disease. We don't typically see the spread of infectious disease this highly ranked. That reflects the fact of the pandemic. But in terms of climate change continuing to be a primary top concern, this got my attention as a pollster. I didn't necessarily think climate change would be so prominent in the context of COVID-19. It underscores how important this issue is, at least for the publics that we surveyed. And you heard from other findings too. It seems to be a very top concern long-term among other publics. You can see other things we asked about do not rank as highly, although there's significant concern about some of these other important issues. We can come back to this slide if there aren't any questions. And let me show you where the UK fell on this set of global threats. If you look at the blue highlighted bar, you'll see that it generally, again, follows the overall trend. Top of mind, in the UK, slightly more focused on the spread of infectious disease. Last summer, about almost as many focused on global climate change as top threats. Declining percentages concerned about other issues, and the least concern is about what we asked as a very bland, neutral way, which is essentially international migration or immigration, although that has been a big issue in the UK and elsewhere at other years. Finally, let me just say that, give you some data about that competing worldview. There is more than one worldview. Even if it's not the majority in our surveys, there is another worldview, which is let's put our country first. Let's not think so much about cooperating with other countries. And what I'm just showing you here is that when we take into account, when we ask people, where are your sympathies? Do you support or not support parties that are on the right and are populist, like Brexit Party as it was named then? When we ask the question, you can see that almost twice as many who support a party like the Brexit Party are saying we should put our own country's interests first. Now, again, this may not be the majority of the public, but it's not an insubstantial portion, and their views are part of the political discourse. And the question that we keep asking, I think, in these conversations, when we talk about important threats for the globe and international cooperation, is the political will always going to be there? There is, I think, based on this kind of finding, still some political challenge for international cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeb. Let me just get my slides up. Thank you. Thanks, Jeb, and thank you to Fabrizio and the UN75 team for giving me and my team at Edelman such a wonderful opportunity to work on this really important and fascinating research. So my presentation, I'm going to take us through a few slides in our primary research where we talk to developing nations. And these will just complement some of the figures that Jeb showed us at the end of his presentation. And then from there, I'm going to dive into the media analysis on a global and a UK level. And hopefully what this will give us is really an understanding of how people are reading about, hearing about, and talking about the UN online, and what informs some of the perceptions that Jeb has touched on and that I will touch on as well. So overall, awareness of the UN in the developing world is high in comparisons with other similar organizations. This awareness is driven by the UN itself, the WHO, and UNICEF. Once we get past those organizations, awareness does dip slightly. 3/4 of the developing world, and I should say here that we spoke to nearly 36,000 people in 36 developing nations across the following regions. And 3/4 of them really see it as an essential organization helping to tackle some of the biggest issues the world faces. This in some regions goes as high as 85% in South and Southeast Asia, and dips as low as 60% in North and Western Africa, obviously a region afflicted with a grave conflict and violence. And when we ask people what is the UN doing in some of these areas, it's very similar to what Jeb's survey asked for developing nations, we actually see that less than 1/3 of people believe that the UN is doing a lot in any one area. Where it does come out strongly is doing a lot in healthcare, again driven by the pandemic that we've talked about already, and the role of the WHO. Also in international terrorism and in climate change, where it comes through quite strongly as well. And I think these are some of the themes that we'll see come out strongly in the media analysis as well. But ultimately, just 6 in 10 believe the UN has made the world a better place. And this dips as low as 45% in North and Western Africa, although it is much higher, nearly 80% in Asia. So really different regions having a very different view in terms of positivity about the role of the UN and what it has achieved and what it is achieving. So now we'll go into the secondary analysis.
In the secondary analysis, we conducted an exercise across 70 countries globally, both developed and developing, and we did a comprehensive media analysis of online media, social media, print media, and broadcast where applicable. And we looked at these 6 broad areas that the UN is interested in being part of the conversation. And when we look at global media here, we really see that in terms of where the highest visibility of the UN is in health, no doubt driven by the pandemic and the role of the WHO, and then followed by shifting demographics and so on. But as you can see, by far, the biggest topic of any media being reported on is conflict and violence. And we'll dive in a little bit more there in terms of how the UN is talked about within that particular area. Across all of these areas, we see that the UN's role in the conversation is not that high in general. It's only about 5% across these key global issues. So what is driving the UN's numbers within those areas? Well, it's mainly driven by UN events, UN announcements, and conflicts. So for example, when we did this media analysis, which was May 2019 to May 2020, the most impactful stories around the UN were Greta Thunberg's UN General Assembly speech and the UN's sharing of the Antifa flag. When you look a little bit further into that conflict and violence and where the UN is coming up in the conversation, see that about 36% of that coverage is around humanitarian crises and human rights, including the Sustainable Development Goals and some mention around COVID-19. 45% of it is really around global crises and conflicts, with a lot of coverage around Kashmir, India, and Pakistan during the time that we looked at this analysis. Now, as an organization, the UN receives minimal negative criticism, despite the fact that most of these topics are talked about very negatively and being the contentious topics that they are. When we look at social media, it's a key channel, contributing 80% of the share of voice of the UN online. So what is happening when it comes to social media and how the UN is talked about? Well, there's really 2 main areas here, and they're around global crisis and human rights and climate change, and they're talked about very differently in both. So when it comes to the global crisis and flashpoints, that's really people are calling the UN to come to arms and really take a role and be active within those areas. When it comes to climate change, actually a lot of the conversation is driven by the UN itself, by its own channels, by UNICEF, and by the Sustainable Development Goals. When it comes to online media and actual news, the UN, again, there's really 2 main areas, which is climate change, where it is in fact used as a platform for other people and other organizations. And then for human rights and security issues in the media, this is very interesting because it's actually positioned as its own voice and a key player in its own right, as opposed to being a platform for others. And finally, when we look at the UK specifically, and we look at the media landscape and where the UN plays, we can see that when we take a step back and we look at the blue bars, really, the pattern of what's reported on the UK media doesn't vary that much to the global picture. What we can see is that when it comes to the UN, it's featured most heavily when it comes to health and climate change. And when it comes to health, and I also draw your attention to shifting demographics, this is really driven by the pandemic. It's driven by the WHO. The reason that it's not just healthcare that is driving the conversation about the WHO here, and also shifting demographics and inequalities, is really looking at a lot of coverage amongst the BAME community about how certain communities are more heavily impacted by COVID and its effects because of previous inequality, and something that we've obviously Jeb and Fabrizio also touched on. When it comes to climate change, role of the UN is very different here. Again, it's really talked about consistently as an expert in these matters, often being strategically positioned aside things like the IPCC reports. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
you very much, Penelope, and thank you, James, for those presentations, very interesting presentations. We have a few questions coming in from the audience, but I'd like to to invite more questions, and I'll be reading them out in a moment from the Q&A. So you can put your questions in the Q&A function. I'd like to start though with a question for Fabrizio to get the discussion going a little bit. You mentioned that there was a unity in people's responses, and you shared very clearly with us that also, there's a sense of nuance in these findings. And I'd like to speak to one of those nuances, because the consultation found that 74% feel that the UN is needed to deal with global challenges, but then far fewer people believe that it deals with those effectively, or that it cares about the needs of ordinary people. So that's a challenging finding. And how can the organization respond to this finding?
Thank you. No, I think looking very carefully at the findings from our direct survey, from the dialogues and the very rich findings from Edelman and Pew, what I personally infer from all that data is people really understand, or the majority of people understand, that this dichotomy which James also alluded to, of you're either a nationalist or you're a globalist, is a false dichotomy. I think most people, of course not everyone, most people understand it, especially young people, that in an interconnected world you need to be both. And I think there is extremely strong support for multilateralism. Within multilateralism, people understand the importance of the UN, but it would be a false inference to think that recognition of the importance of the UN is uncritical or is unquestioning. I think the results, both from Pew and Edelman, show that while people believe the UN is important, and even more important in the future than it was in the past, or even more important for future challenges than its contribution over the past 75 years, people believe that it deserves further improvement. It is seen as relatively remote, but having said that, I mean, I think it's also a little bit how you present the answers. I mean, you can say that half the people don't feel the UN has had a direct impact in their lives, or you could say half people feel that the UN has had a very direct impact in people's lives. Both are true, but one way you're talking about a glass half full, one way you're talking about a glass half empty. You can say that 2/3 of people don't believe that the UN has made a major contribution in these areas, or you can say 2/3 of people believe that the UN has done something and is contributing something to these areas. So, I'm not sure that the findings, if you think of us as an international organization that is smaller than most national police departments or most national fire services, that has a budget that is more or less the equivalent of what it takes to stage one Formula One race. I'm not sure that the findings about our impact and our relevance are as negative as one could possibly phrase them. Having said that, and I stress this in all my presentations, there's no room for complacency. I think the UN has a communications challenge, has a communications problem, and it needs to address it. I think the UN has an inclusivity problem and needs to address it. And I do think we need to address the guidance, and we also need to address our critics. I mean, we also need to take into account what was in James's last slide about those who don't feel heard by the UN, who do feel internationalism, if anything, is a threat. Even if they are a minority, it would be very foolish not to try and understand and address better those concerns. So I think we need to grow more inclusive. I think we need to listen much better to our critics. And I certainly think we need to improve communication. But I mean, the best form of communication is the production of results. So that is the main thing.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. I'm now going to turn to the questions that have come in. So the first question I have here is from the UK's National Commission for UNESCO. And they're asking, what is the #1 thing that it will take to turn the UN consultation priorities into actions that will be prioritized by national leaders and voters? Yes, so that speaks certainly to James's point about political will. Fabrizio, would you like to take this question, or should we put it to James?
Well, maybe I can have a first stab, but I would say it will take two things. I mean, it will take good ideas, but I think in many of the areas like climate change, there's no lack of good ideas. There's no lack of solutions. And that brings me to my second point. So in some areas, like making the UN more inclusive, we need new ideas. But in other areas, there are very well thought through solutions. So there, I think the issue is political will. And having a conducive environment. I think there are many national leaders who feel investing on the international arena, investing in decisions that will bring long-term benefits are not conducive to winning elections in the short term. And that's why I think highlighting that there is a popular appetite for concern with the impact we're having on our planet long term. There is a popular appetite for contributing to global public goods is particularly important. And that's why I think promoting the outcome of our findings, so they're not a matter of personal opinion of somebody with a particular political agenda, but they really are based on a very broad reach out exercise. Why that's so important, because we need both the solutions, but more importantly, or as importantly, the political will and the conducive political environment that allows decision makers to feel comfortable with pursuing them and not feel that they're going to immediately be voted out of office or lose support. The same goes for business leaders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Did James or Penelope wish to add to that?
I mean, I just quickly wanted to add that I want to take some of the burden off Fabrizio and just say that really the way he and Natalie have led this effort with UN75 Global Dialogue is exactly what he said. I've been really impressed by the willingness to hear criticism and to treat it in a constructive way. Let me say, if you want to use the glass full analogy, our findings generally are the glass is more than half full in a positive way, right? But I really appreciate Fabrizio and others at the UN saying, look, we need to take the empty part of this glass seriously. And, you know, we're not an advocacy and we don't have solutions. But I do think two things I've shared in other conversations. One, the UN's not the only multilateral organization that faces this challenge. So don't make this only about the United Nations. We've asked a lot of the same questions about the EU. They are also seen as aloof in Brussels. And you even have a parliament for people as citizens to have a voice in the EU. So it's a challenge, I think, for multilateral efforts and organizations. And then what is important, to Fabrizio's point, clearly there are certain threats are more important than others in the public's minds. I think Fabrizio in particular has really focused us as a group on the question of political will, and that's not just what, that's how. And so I think it's great that we're treating the data in this fashion. I don't know if Penn has anything to add to that, but I would just say Penn's findings were independent of ours, and we're seeing similar things. There's some power in that too.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just like to say, I think there's a real power in communication and actually talking about the things that people think they know about the UN, particularly in the developing world. People think they know what they're doing and so on. And they're also very positive about the concepts of multilateralism and international cooperation. But it's not necessarily that the two go hand in hand. So I think there's also something to be said about communicating, being more transparent, talking, and reaching people in that way. So not necessarily even doing something different to start off with, but to actually really share the message of what you actually are doing for people who might not know.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to the next question that we have from the audience, from Tom Megal, which is, as COVID progresses, we're seeing the world drowning in national isolation and lack of support for the poorest. The access to vaccines and establishment of test and trace systems are key for countries to recover. What are the UN's plans to convince developed and wealthy communities to support faster access to vaccines and structural support, especially the EU, the US, China, and Japan? So.
Well, I mean, the Secretary General with WHO have been pushing very hard to get adequate support to this COVAX initiative, which is a global fund to ensure a fair distribution of vaccines that focuses on distribution according to need, as opposed to distribution according to resources. It's underfunded, but many countries have made important contributions, including the UK and the EU. And in terms with addressing the economic fallout, there's also been a lot of leadership by the Secretary General. I mean, with Canada and Jamaica, he's chaired heads of state meetings. The deputy has chaired Minister of Finance meetings. To look at debt relief and similar measures and greater investment in developing countries. So those efforts are all ongoing. But there is an inevitable and also understandable trend for countries to look first and foremost about what they can do for their own citizens, and nobody suggesting, certainly at the UN, that shouldn't be the case. But what we are calling for is both focus on domestic needs, but not at the cost of also doing something internationally, because, as has often been said, COVID won't be overcome anywhere until it's overcome everywhere.
Thank you very much. James or Penelope, would you like to add anything? No? Okay, so let's move on to the third question. This is from Patricia Rogers, and it's specifically for James. Why do you think people in Japan think unfavorably of the UN, as opposed to South Korea, which was also critical of the WHO? Yeah, it's an obvious, quite an odd finding in some ways. Would you like to take that question, James?
Would I like to take the question, or will I take the question? I will take the question. I've been asked this question many times over the last few months, and I appreciate it, because what it points out is, just as you look at data, as I'm sure Penn agrees, one thing is, as we're talking about, we want to look at the most consistent, broad patterns, but we also want to pay attention to some of the outliers. And why are these places different? And maybe that helps us understand those broad trends that are more common to the countries and publics we're talking about. And I think this is the case. Japan is an outlier. To some degree, South Korea is an outlier compared to the countries we surveyed at the Pew Research Center. What's going on? Well, one thing we can say confidently based on our own data from these surveys and looking at that data is that in these countries, opinion about how the WHO handled the coronavirus outbreak was a factor that drove down overall favorable opinion of the UN, because there was definitely public criticism or dissatisfaction with how the WHO handled the outbreak. And that was one of the key factors affecting opinion of the UN overall in these countries. Now, I actually had taken the time, I won't spend a lot of time in this, but just so people know, engage with people who know a lot about Japan as a society, as a media environment. And there's also context here. One is a trend of Japanese public being very aware of not having a seat on UN Security Council. And there's just a general maybe context that that's important there. We know from our own polling that there's also unease about China and its influence in the world. And according to people who know the Japanese media environment, there was a story, a narrative about how the WHO handled this was in a way appeasing China. I don't have facts from our survey that puts all those things together in a nice, neat way, but I just think it points out the context for each country is a bit different. And the final thing I'll say is that it also points out it wasn't a guarantee that the UN would come out looking in a good way during this COVID pandemic, or that we wouldn't find similar depressed, more negative views elsewhere. We didn't. So in a way, again, the exception of Japan and South Korea points out that yes, it can happen, but overall, it was a good year in terms of people having confidence in UN and WHO.
I can add to this from the media analysis as well, looking at Japan, where actually the WHO has a much higher proportion amongst the health debate online, with over 25% of mentions actually being around the WHO, and a lot of that coverage being quite neutral or negative. And as Jeb says, in relation to China as well. And just further to that, in general, the UN is talked about quite differently in Japanese media, which is quite neutral as a source of facts, rather than an organization which actually acts or has an expert voice, for example.
Thank you, Penelope. The next question I want to read out is from Jane Howard, who's actually on my team at the World Food Programme. And she's asking, were there any results from the UK that surprised the researchers? That could be for Penelope, I think.
On a personal level, no, as I live in the UK, so nothing was particularly surprising about it. But to be perfectly honest, the tone, which is not something I say, but tone of UK media tends to be very neutral or negative. It doesn't tend to be solution focused. And what did surprise me in a positive way was that the UN itself is quite immune from that. It is still spoken about very positively, and it is spoken about consistently across all those areas as an expert voice. So that surprised me.
Mm-hmm.
And could I just add that our trends on a British opinion of the UN are very consistent, including in 2020. So to Penn's point, this is not like this year suddenly the UN is seen favorably. It's more or less in this range of 70, strong majority, let's put it, favorable in our polling since 2006. So I think it's indicative of a worldview among many in Britain, and interesting to hear Penn's comments too.
Good, thank you very much, James. Now we're going to be wrapping up soon, and there's one last question, which I think is a very fitting last question, which is from Edward Mortimer, which is basically what next? This is going to be a question for Fabrizio. What conclusions does the SG and the UN more generally plan to draw from these findings? So, how are we going to move forward, Fabrizio, really to listen now to these findings and make our organization so much better and more responsive?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there will be very concrete follow-up in the form of a series of proposals by the Secretary General, looking comprehensively and much more comprehensively than his previous reform efforts about how the organization should be upgraded and reimagined. And it will go beyond just looking at the UN Secretariat. It will look at the principal organs of the UN, other principal organs of the UN. So there will be some very concrete solutions that will build on the findings. But of course, as Edward knows very well, it's often not the intelligence of the solutions that matters, but rather the political will that allows them to be implemented. That's why I think it's so important that we continue in the lead up to the Secretary General presenting that report in late summer to try and build political will for the sort of ambitious turnaround that the world clearly wants, that some refer to as a global reset. I mean, it goes under lots of different headings, but as many commentators have pointed out, as tragic and painful as COVID is, it's also a unique opportunity, as crises have been in the past, for a fresh look at policy, a fresh look at allocation of public funds, etc. So there is a real opportunity now for a new beginning, and it would be sad if we don't make the most of it. The other thing I'd like to mention, I mean, we would hope, I mean, this has been a fairly unique exercise in terms of trying to systematically understand from the heart of the UN what the world thinks are its priorities, and how the UN perceives, how people perceive international cooperation in the UN in particular. I mean, I think the Secretary General would like to make this a periodic exercise, and we're talking, that was always the idea with the Pew Research Center, to try and see how we can do this more systematically, periodically, because as everyone knows, these findings also grow much more interesting when one can compare them over time. So the snapshot is less, as interesting as it may be, is even more interesting when it's compared, when one can see evolution over time. So I think this is part of a greater effort of the Secretary General to make the UN overall more accountable and more attuned to what people think across the world.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. So I'd like to thank Fabrizio, Penelope, and James, and I'm going to hand back to Nitya for the closing remarks. And thank you to the audience for some very thought-provoking questions.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to add my thanks to Fabrizio and the UN75 team, particularly Natalie. Thanks also to James from Pew and Penelope from Edelman for this extremely illuminating presentation and discussion. Thanks to Elizabeth for moderating, and UNA UK for providing us with this platform this evening. As Fabrizio mentioned, the results of the global consultation will be taken forward through the UN Secretary General's follow-up process, which will involve reaching out to UN member states as well as to civil society, youth, as well as other stakeholders to feed into his report on next steps. This is due to be published in the late summer this year. I'm sure that the UN and UNA UK will keep you informed of the process, and more information is available on www.un75.online. The results of the UN75 Global Consultation proves that coordinated multilateral action for people and the planet has never been needed more. The UN makes a real difference in people's lives around the world, and this is made possible only with the support of our partners. We are convinced we achieve more through collaboration and cooperation, and we look forward to continuing and expanding our strong partnership with the government of the United Kingdom. Thank you once again very much for joining us this evening, and have a good night.